Tonight, as you settle into the quiet sanctuary of your evening, we're exploring a question that has whispered through the corridors of power for over 500 years. A question so provocative it could reshape how you think about strength, kindness, and what it truly means to be effective in this world. You might think that being good and being powerful are natural opposites, that virtue and influence exist on different sides of some moral divide. But tonight we'll discover that perhaps the most dangerous people of all are those who have learned to master both. If you're enjoying these philosophical journeys into the deeper questions of human nature, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it tells me you're finding value in these gentle explorations of wisdom that spans centuries. I'm always curious where you all are listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. I love seeing our little global community connect through these stories, knowing that somewhere someone in Tokyo is drifting off to these same thoughts while someone in London is just beginning their day. Now dim the lights around you, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, or perhaps light a candle if that helps you unwind. Let your body ease into whatever surface supports you tonight. Your bed, your favorite chair, that spot on the couch where you can truly relax. Feel the weight of the day beginning to lift from your shoulders. And let's ease into tonight's exploration of a man whose name has become synonymous with cunning, but whose true wisdom might be far gentler and more necessary than you've ever imagined. Picture yourself stepping through the heavy wooden door of a modest study on the outskirts of Florence, in the year 1513. The late afternoon light filters through small, diamond-paned windows, casting long golden rectangles across worn leather-bound books and scattered parchments. You notice the smell of ink, that sharp metallic scent that speaks of fresh thoughts being committed to paper, mixing with the warmer aroma of olive wood burning in a small fireplace. As you settle into a simple wooden chair, feeling the smooth grain of the armrest under your fingertips, you hear the distant sound of church bells echoing across the Tuscan countryside, their bronze voices carrying on the autumn air. The man hunched over the writing desk before you is smaller than you might have expected, his hair thinning, his clothes showing the wear of someone whose fortune has seen better days. This is Niccolo Machiavelli, and he's in exile, cast out from the political life he loved, suspected of conspiracy, having survived imprisonment and torture just months before. His hands, as they grip the quill, still bear the subtle tremors that come from having been stretched on the rack. Yet here he is, writing with an intensity that seems to burn away everything but the truth he's trying to capture. Like many of us who have faced unexpected loss or found ourselves stripped of the roles that once defined us, Machiavelli has discovered that sometimes our deepest insights come not from success, but from the clear-eyed perspective that follows defeat. You might recognize this feeling, that strange clarity that emerges when the comfortable illusions of how the world should work are suddenly swept away, leaving only the stark reality of how it actually does work. What if everything you'd been taught about being good, about virtue and moral behavior, was not wrong exactly, but incomplete? What if there were a kind of goodness so profound, so grounded in reality rather than wishful thinking, that it could navigate the treacherous waters of human nature without losing its essential integrity? This is the question that drives Machiavelli's quill across the parchment, and it's the question that will guide us through tonight's gentle journey into some of the most challenging and ultimately liberating ideas about power, influence, and what it means to be truly effective in a complex world. Consider for a moment someone you know who seems to accomplish things with remarkable ease, not through manipulation or cruelty, but through a kind of centered strength that others naturally respect. There's something about such people that's both magnetic and slightly mysterious. They seem to understand rules of human interaction that operate below the surface of our everyday awareness, and they move through conflicts and challenges with a grace that suggests deep wells of both wisdom and restraint. Perhaps you've wondered what separates those who mean well from those who do well. Those whose good intentions remain just that, from those who somehow manage to transform their values into tangible results in the messy, complicated arena of real human relationships. Tonight, we're going to explore the possibility that this difference isn't about abandoning our moral compass, but about developing a more sophisticated understanding of how virtue actually operates in a world where not everyone shares our noble intentions. As we journey deeper tonight through these ideas that have shaped leaders, influenced nations, and guided some of history's most effective individuals, you might find yourself wondering about the nature of strength itself. Is true power something we take from others, or something we cultivate within ourselves? Can we remain fundamentally good people while learning to be more strategic, more aware, more dangerous in the most constructive sense of that word? This question opens doors to insights about emotional intelligence, about the psychology of influence, about the ancient wisdom that taught philosophers to build inner citadels of strength while remaining deeply connected to their humanity. There's something soothing about following these thought paths that have been walked by great minds across centuries, knowing that the questions we're exploring tonight are the same ones that have puzzled and inspired human beings for thousands of years. As you drift deeper into relaxation, feeling your breathing slow and your mind begin to release the practical concerns of the day, perhaps you'll discover that the journey from being merely good to being genuinely effective isn't a corruption of character but a completion of it. And perhaps by morning, you'll have found that what makes someone truly dangerous in the best sense is not their willingness to harm others, but their commitment to building something so strong and centered within themselves that nothing external can shake their ability to do what's right. To truly understand what Machiavelli discovered in that exile study, what insights emerged from his painful confrontation with the gap between idealistic politics and political reality, we need to first step back into his world, a world where survival itself hung in the balance, where the luxury of moral purity could mean the death of everything you held dear. Let's allow ourselves to drift back to Renaissance Florence, where the cobblestones still hold the warmth of the day's sun, and the very air seems charged with the tension between competing visions of how human beings should live together. This understanding opens a doorway to a world that shaped not just one man's thinking, but the very nature of how we understand power itself. As these thoughts about the gap between idealistic politics and political reality settle like sediment in still water, you might find yourself curious about what it felt like to live in a time when such questions weren't philosophical luxuries, but matters of daily survival. Imagine yourself standing in the Piazza della Signoria in Florence on a crisp morning in the year 1498. The uneven stones beneath your feet still hold a hint of coolness from the night, and you can feel their irregular surfaces even through the leather soles of your shoes. The air carries that distinctive scent of a city awakening, wood smoke from countless hearths mixing with the yeasty aroma of bread baking in the workshops that line the narrow streets, and underneath it all, the faint metallic tang of the Arno River flowing just beyond the city walls. You're witnessing a world unlike anything that exists today, a landscape of perpetual political uncertainty where the very ground rules of power shift with each season. Italy in Machiavelli's time isn't a unified nation but a collection of rival city-states, each one a miniature kingdom with its own army, its own currency, its own fierce pride, and its own desperate need to survive in a world where today's ally could become tomorrow's conqueror. Florence, where you now stand, is a republic, proud of its constitution that limits the power of nobility, proud of its tradition of self-governance, yet surrounded on all sides by kingdoms ruled by absolute monarchs who view this experiment in popular government with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. The merchants and bankers hurrying past you through the piazza are acutely aware that their prosperity, their very lives, depend on a delicate balance of power that could shift at any moment. Perhaps you felt something similar in your own life, that sense of walking on uncertain ground, where the rules you thought you understood could change without warning, where the security you took for granted reveals itself to be more fragile than you'd ever imagined. In Renaissance Italy, this uncertainty isn't a temporary crisis but a permanent condition, a reality that shapes every decision, every alliance, every conversation in ways both subtle and profound. Picture young Niccolo Machiavelli in 1498, just 29 years old, walking these same stones as he makes his way to the Palazzo Vecchio for his first day as second chancellor of the Florentine Republic. You might notice the careful attention he pays to the faces around him, the way he observes the subtle dynamics of power playing out in seemingly casual encounters. The baker who nods deferentially to certain customers while barely acknowledging others, the merchants who cluster in particular corners of the square, the way conversations pause when certain figures approach. All of this is data, information about how influence really flows through the arteries of the city. For the next 14 years, Machiavelli will serve at the heart of Florentine diplomacy, undertaking more than 40 missions that will take him from the courts of kings to the camps of mercenary armies. He'll sit across negotiating tables from some of the most ruthless and brilliant political minds of his age, men like Cesare Borgia, whose combination of charm and calculated violence will both fascinate and horrify him. Through these experiences, he'll develop what you might recognize as a form of professional empathy, not the emotional overwhelming that comes from feeling others' pain too deeply, but the strategic understanding that comes from studying human nature with the same careful attention a physician brings to understanding the body. Interestingly, these diplomatic missions will teach him something that contradicts almost everything the political theorists of his time believe about how states should be run. The conventional wisdom insists that virtue, justice, and moral righteousness are the foundations of political stability. Good princes, the textbooks claim, will naturally be successful princes, because God favors the righteous and people naturally prefer to follow moral leaders. But Machiavelli watches this theory collide with reality again and again, seeing virtuous rulers destroyed by less scrupulous neighbors, witnessing honest negotiations undermined by calculated deception, observing how quickly popular sentiment can turn when survival is at stake. As you consider this clash between ideal and reality, you might notice how it mirrors smaller versions of the same conflict in your own experience. Perhaps you've found yourself in situations where doing the obviously right thing would have led to disaster for everyone involved, where pure honesty would have caused unnecessary pain, where a little strategic silence served everyone's interests better than complete transparency. These aren't moral failures but recognitions of complexity, acknowledgments that the world is more nuanced than our simplest ethical frameworks can capture. The turning point comes in 1512, when the Spanish army restores the Medici family to power in Florence, crushing the republic that has been Machiavelli's life's work. In a single stroke, everything he has built, every relationship he has cultivated, every skill he has developed becomes not just useless but dangerous. The new regime sees him as a threat, not because he has done anything wrong, but because he represents the old order, the dream of republican government that the Medici find inconvenient. The imprisonment that follows is brief but brutal. The strapado, a form of torture where the victim is hoisted by ropes tied to their hands behind their back, leaves Machiavelli with injuries that will trouble him for the rest of his life. But perhaps more painful than the physical trauma is the psychological displacement, the sense of being cast out from the world where he felt most alive, most useful, most himself. You might recognize this particular form of suffering, not just the loss of position or status, but the deeper wound of finding yourself excluded from the very arena where your talents feel most essential. It's in this state of exile, in this enforced separation from the political life he loves, that Machiavelli begins to write with a clarity and urgency that will echo through the centuries. The small estate outside Florence, where he now spends his days, becomes a kind of laboratory for understanding power, a place where he can examine the patterns he witnessed during his years in government without the immediate pressure of having to act on that knowledge. The olive trees that surround his modest villa rustle with the same wind that once carried the sounds of political intrigue through the corridors of the Palazzo Vecchio. But now that wind brings something different. The space for reflection, for synthesis, for the kind of deep thinking that can only happen when the urgency of immediate action gives way to the luxury of understanding. Each evening, he tells us in his letters, he changes from his muddy work clothes into the formal robes he once wore to court, and he enters his study to commune with the great political thinkers of antiquity. Through their writings, he converses with Caesar and Cicero, with Livy and Tacitus, comparing their insights with his own hard-won experience, testing their theories against the reality he has witnessed firsthand. This ritual, touching in its formality and its longing, becomes the crucible where ancient wisdom meets contemporary experience, where the timeless questions of power and virtue are re-examined in the light of everything he has learned about how human beings actually behave when survival is at stake. As these images of exile and reflection wash over you, settling into that peaceful space where understanding doesn't require effort, you might begin to sense how this particular combination of practical experience and enforced contemplation created the perfect conditions for insights that still shape how we think about leadership, influence, and the eternal tension between our ideals and our effectiveness. The man who emerges from this period of exile will have something rare to offer, a theory of power grounded not in wishful thinking about how people should behave, but in careful observation of how they actually do behave when everything they value hangs in the balance. This naturally raises the question that will drive everything Machiavelli writes from this point forward, a question that bridges the personal and the political, the individual and the state, the moral and the practical. Following this thread deeper into the heart of what it means to be good in a complicated world, you might find yourself wondering about something that touches every relationship, every decision, every moment when we choose how to respond to others. What if the very quality we most admire in ourselves and others, that instinctive kindness, that selfless desire to help, that generous impulse to put someone else's needs before our own, could sometimes become the very thing that undermines not just our own well-being, but our ability to actually help the people we care about most? This isn't a cynical question, but a gentle invitation to examine something most of us have experienced without quite understanding what was happening. Picture yourself for a moment in a quiet garden at twilight, where the last rays of sunlight filter through leaves that rustle with the softest evening breeze. You're walking along a narrow path that winds between raised beds of herbs, lavender releasing its calming scent as you brush past, rosemary filling the air with its sharp, clean fragrance. In this peaceful setting, imagine encountering two different gardeners, each tending their plants with obvious care and dedication, yet approaching their work in remarkably different ways. The first gardener moves through the space with a kind of urgent anxiety, constantly watering, constantly adjusting, hovering over each plant as if sheer attention could force it to flourish. When you watch more closely, you notice something troubling. Many of the plants in this section appear overwatered, their roots beginning to rot from too much kindness, their leaves yellowing from an excess of care. This gardener's heart is clearly in the right place. The love for the plants is obvious, genuine, almost painful in its intensity. Yet somehow this very love has become destructive, creating the opposite of what was intended. The second gardener works with a different rhythm entirely, moving through their section with calm attention, observing carefully before acting, sometimes choosing not to water when the soil already holds enough moisture, occasionally removing dead growth even when it means the plant looks temporarily bare. There's something in this gardener's approach that speaks of a deeper understanding, not just of what feels good to give, but of what each plant actually needs to thrive. The plants in this section display a vibrant, resilient health that comes not from constant intervention, but from wise attention and appropriate restraint. Perhaps you've recognized these two approaches in your own life, in your own relationships, in the way you've tried to help others or care for yourself. We all know the feeling of wanting so desperately to fix someone's pain that we end up making choices that feel good in the moment, but create bigger problems down the road. This isn't a moral failing. It's something much more subtle and interesting, something that reveals the complex relationship between our intentions and their actual effects in the world. As you settle deeper into this exploration, letting your breathing slow and your thoughts soften around the edges, consider what happens when our capacity for empathy becomes so overwhelming that we lose the ability to see clearly what's actually helpful. The ancient philosophers had a name for this kind of clear-sighted caring. They called it wisdom, and they understood it as something quite different from mere kindness or good intentions. For the Stoics, particularly, virtue wasn't primarily about feeling the right emotions, but about developing the strength to respond appropriately regardless of what emotions arose. Imagine, if you will, a scene from ancient Athens, where the afternoon sun casts long shadows across the agora and the sound of fountains mingles with distant conversations. Here, philosophers like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius developed an understanding of strength that sounds almost paradoxical to our modern ears. They argued that true virtue, real goodness, actually makes a person invulnerable, not vulnerable. Not invulnerable in the sense of being hard or uncaring, but invulnerable in the way that a deeply rooted tree is invulnerable, flexible enough to bend with the storm, yet so firmly grounded that no external force can topple it. This Stoic vision of virtue is built on a foundation that might seem strange at first. The idea that the only thing that can truly harm us is our own response to events, not the events themselves. External circumstances, whether pleasant or painful, whether bringing success or failure, are what the Stoics called indifference, meaning they have no power to make us fundamentally better or worse as human beings. What matters is how we choose to meet whatever comes, and that choice, they insisted, remains entirely within our control regardless of what's happening around us. You might have experienced glimpses of this kind of strength in your own life, those moments when something that would normally upset you simply didn't touch that deeper place of calm, when you found yourself able to respond to difficulty with a kind of clear presence that surprised even you. These moments hint at what the Stoics believed was possible, a way of being in the world that draws its stability not from controlling external circumstances, but from mastering internal responses. But here's where the philosophy becomes especially relevant to our question about the dangers of unchecked goodness. The Stoics understood that this inner fortress, this psychological invulnerability, actually enhances rather than diminishes our ability to help others effectively. When we're not constantly thrown off balance by our own emotional reactions, when we're not desperately trying to fix others in order to manage our own discomfort with their pain, we can see more clearly what kind of help is actually useful versus what kind merely makes us feel better about ourselves. As these ideas wash over you like gentle waves, you might notice how they connect to something you already know from your own experience. Perhaps you've been in situations where someone's eager to help energy actually made things worse, where their anxiety about your problem became another problem you had to manage, where their need to fix things prevented you from finding your own way through a difficulty. Or perhaps you've been the one whose caring, however genuine, created complications rather than solutions. This brings us to what psychologists now call pathological altruism, a term that captures something the ancient philosophers intuited but didn't name directly. It's the phenomenon that occurs when our sincere desire to help others ends up causing harm that anyone watching from the outside could reasonably have predicted. The parent who enables their child's destructive behavior by constantly rescuing them from consequences. The friend who gives advice that serves their own need to feel helpful rather than addressing what the other person actually needs. The leader who avoids necessary difficult conversations because they can't bear to cause anyone discomfort, thereby allowing problems to grow until they become much more painful for everyone involved. Interestingly, this pattern often involves what researchers call the empathy trap, the difference between empathy and compassion that becomes clearer when we imagine two different responses to finding someone in a deep pit. Empathy is the impulse to climb down into the pit with them, to feel their distress as your own distress, to share their stuckness and their panic. It's driven by mirror neurons and emotional contagion, and while it can motivate helping behavior, it can also overwhelm our ability to actually help. Compassion, by contrast, is the choice to remain on solid ground while extending a rope, to feel genuine concern for their predicament without losing your own stability and therefore your capacity to be useful. Perhaps you can feel the difference between these two approaches settling into your awareness like sediment in still water. One dissolves the boundaries between self and other in a way that feels generous but often proves counterproductive. The other maintains enough separateness to preserve the clarity and strength needed for effective action. This isn't coldness. It's a more mature form of caring, one that prioritizes outcomes over feelings, results over intentions. As you drift deeper into this understanding, you might begin to sense how this connects back to Machiavelli's central insight about the sometimes tragic gap between good intentions and good results. Just as he observed that virtuous rulers could be destroyed by less scrupulous neighbors, we can observe that people motivated by pure kindness can sometimes cause more harm than those who approach helping with more strategic awareness. The question isn't whether to care. Caring is beautiful and necessary, but how to care in ways that actually serve what we care about. This recognition opens onto something larger and more hopeful than it might initially seem. The understanding that real virtue, the kind that actually accomplishes good in the world, requires this integration of compassion with wisdom, of caring with competence, of good intentions with realistic understanding of how change actually happens in complex human systems. As these thoughts settle like sediment in still water, you might find yourself curious about what such integrated strength actually looks like when it's embodied in a human being. Perhaps you've known someone who seemed unshakable, someone who remained calm in storms that sent others reeling, who could face difficult situations with a kind of centered presence that felt both powerful and peaceful. There's something distinctive about such people, not the brittle hardness of someone who has shut down emotionally, but rather the flexible strength of a tree that bends with the wind yet never loses its rootedness, never compromises its essential nature even when external circumstances become challenging. Picture yourself walking through an ancient olive grove on a hillside overlooking the Mediterranean, where trees that have stood for centuries continue to bear fruit despite having weathered countless storms. The late afternoon light filters through their silvery leaves, casting dancing shadows on the rocky ground beneath your feet. You can smell the warm earth, still holding the heat of the day, mixed with that distinctive green scent of olive oil that seems to permeate everything in this landscape. As you lean against one of these ancient trunks, feeling its weathered bark rough against your palm, you begin to understand something about the nature of true resilience. These trees have survived not by resisting every wind that has blown across this hillside, but by developing a kind of flexible strength that allows them to yield without breaking, to bend without losing their essential structure. Their roots run deep into the rocky soil, finding nourishment and stability even in harsh conditions, while their branches maintain enough flexibility to dance with whatever weather comes their way. They embody a paradox that the ancient philosophers understood deeply. That real strength often looks like yielding, that true power frequently manifests as adaptability rather than rigid control. This is the kind of strength that the Stoic philosophers were pointing toward when they talked about virtue as the foundation of human flourishing. For them, virtue wasn't primarily about following rules or performing good actions, though these things mattered. Rather, it was about cultivating an internal state of being that could remain stable and effective regardless of external circumstances. They understood virtue as a kind of psychological architecture, a way of structuring the inner life that made it impossible for external events to fundamentally disturb one's peace or compromise one's capacity to respond wisely. Imagine, if you will, a fortress built not of stone and mortar, but of understanding and self-mastery. The walls of this fortress are constructed from deep knowledge of what is and isn't within your control, from the hard-won wisdom that comes from learning to distinguish between what you can influence and what you must simply accept. The foundation is laid with practices of attention and awareness, the daily work of observing your own reactions, understanding your patterns, recognizing the difference between your immediate emotional responses and your considered choices about how to act. You might recognize elements of this fortress in your own experience, those moments when something that would normally upset you simply didn't penetrate to that deeper place of calm, when you found yourself able to respond to criticism or difficulty with a clarity that surprised even you. These moments hint at what the Stoics believed was possible, a way of being in the world that draws its strength not from controlling what happens to you, but from mastering how you meet whatever comes. Interestingly, this kind of inner fortress doesn't make someone cold or disconnected. Quite the opposite. It creates the stable platform from which genuine compassion becomes possible. When you're not constantly thrown off balance by your own emotional reactions, when you're not desperately trying to control other people's responses in order to maintain your own equilibrium, you can actually see more clearly what's happening in any given situation and respond from a place of wisdom rather than reactivity. As you consider this idea, letting it wash over you like gentle waves on a peaceful shore, you might notice how it connects to something you already know about the difference between anxiety and concern, between worry and care. Anxiety is what happens when our caring becomes contaminated with our own need for control, when our love for someone gets tangled up with our fear of what might happen to them. Concern, by contrast, is what emerges when we care deeply, but from a place of acceptance about what is and isn't ours to determine. This distinction becomes especially clear when we think about how differently these two states affect our ability to actually help. The anxious person, however well-intentioned, often creates additional stress for everyone around them. Their worry becomes another problem that others have to manage. Their need for reassurance becomes an additional burden on people who are already dealing with their own challenges. The person who cares from a place of centered strength, however, can offer their presence and support without adding the weight of their own emotional urgency to an already difficult situation. Perhaps you've experienced both sides of this dynamic, times when someone's anxious caring made a situation more stressful, and times when someone's calm presence helped you find your own center even in the midst of difficulty. There's something profoundly nourishing about being around people who have cultivated this kind of strength, this ability to remain present and engaged without needing everything to be different than it is. The ancient philosophers understood that developing this kind of inner architecture required recognizing something that sounds almost backwards to our modern ears, that our happiness, our peace of mind, our fundamental well-being cannot depend on external circumstances if it's going to be reliable and sustainable. They didn't mean we should be indifferent to what happens in the world, quite the contrary. They meant that our capacity to engage effectively with whatever is happening must be grounded in something more stable than the fluctuating conditions around us. Put differently, they discovered that the people who are most able to influence their circumstances positively are often those who are least dependent on circumstances for their sense of internal stability. This isn't a paradox, but a practical insight about how influence actually works. When your well-being depends on getting specific outcomes, you tend to approach situations with a kind of desperate energy that often backfires. When your well-being is grounded in your own capacity to respond wisely regardless of outcomes, you can engage with situations more skillfully, more creatively, more effectively. You might think of it like the difference between swimming upstream and swimming with the current. The person who desperately needs things to be different is like someone swimming upstream, exhausting themselves fighting against the flow, making slow progress, creating lots of turbulence. The person who has cultivated inner stability can read the currents more accurately, can find ways to work with the natural flow of events while still moving in their chosen direction. This doesn't mean becoming passive or accepting injustice. Rather, it means developing the kind of clear-sighted strength that can engage with difficult realities without being overwhelmed by them. That can work for positive change without being crushed when change comes slowly or takes unexpected forms. It's the difference between reactive activism and responsive engagement, between fighting against what you don't want and working skillfully for what you do want. As these ideas drift through your awareness like clouds across a peaceful sky, you might begin to sense how this inner architecture of strength naturally leads to questions about how such strength expresses itself in the world of relationships and influence, how this kind of centered presence translates into the ability to guide and inspire others. Following this thread deeper into the territory where personal virtue meets the practical challenges of living and working with other human beings, we find ourselves drawn back to that candle-lit room where Machiavelli sits in exile, wrestling with insights that will challenge everything his world believes about the relationship between goodness and power. Picture yourself settling into a comfortable chair beside his writing desk on one of those long winter evenings in 1513, the fire crackling softly in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the worn leather bindings of ancient texts. The air carries the scent of parchment and ink, mixed with the woody fragrance of burning olive logs, and you can hear the scratch of his quill moving steadily across the page as he works to capture something that feels both dangerous and necessary. There's a weight to the silence between his pen strokes, a sense that the words he's choosing will echo far beyond this modest room, beyond his own century, into territories of human understanding that remain largely unexplored. What emerges from these evening sessions is something that sounds almost heretical to the conventional wisdom of his time. The radical suggestion that the world of political action operates according to different rules than the world of private morality, and that a leader who tries to apply the same standards to both realms may end up serving neither effectively. This isn't the cynical abandonment of virtue that his critics will later claim, but rather a more complex and nuanced understanding of how virtue actually functions when it must operate in systems where not everyone shares the same commitments to truth, justice, and the common good. You might recognize this tension from your own experience in smaller ways, perhaps in workplace situations where pure honesty would have created unnecessary conflict, or in family dynamics where complete transparency might have caused more harm than carefully chosen discretion. We all navigate this space between our private values and our public effectiveness, though we rarely acknowledge the complexity of these choices or examine them with the kind of systematic attention that Machiavelli brings to bear. As you consider this idea, letting it settle into your awareness like sediment in still water, imagine what it might mean to develop what Machiavelli calls virtue, a quality that encompasses not just moral virtue in the traditional sense, but something broader and more practically oriented. The skill, the courage, the strategic awareness needed to accomplish good things in a world that doesn't always reward good intentions. This virtue is like a combination of the sailor's ability to read wind patterns, the gardener's instinct for timing, and the diplomat's gift for finding language that serves truth without creating unnecessary enemies. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of Machiavelli's insight is his observation that a person of integrity sometimes faces what we might call the moral paradox of leadership, situations where adhering strictly to conventional virtue would result in outcomes that contradict the deeper purposes that virtue is meant to serve. The parent who lies to protect their child from information that would cause unnecessary trauma. The leader who withholds complete transparency about a decision in order to prevent panic that would make the situation worse for everyone. The friend who chooses strategic silence rather than brutal honesty when someone needs support more than criticism. These aren't failures of moral reasoning, but recognitions of moral complexity, acknowledgments that the world rarely presents us with choices between obvious good and obvious evil. More often, we find ourselves choosing between competing goods, weighing short-term costs against long-term benefits, balancing our responsibilities to individuals against our obligations to larger communities or principles. Machiavelli's great contribution is his insistence that we examine these trade-offs honestly rather than pretending they don't exist, or that good intentions alone can resolve them. Interestingly, this more sophisticated approach to virtue doesn't make someone amoral, but rather demands a higher level of moral development, the kind that can hold complexity without collapsing into either rigid rule-following or unprincipled opportunism. It requires what you might think of as moral maturity, the capacity to serve genuine ethical purposes through means that may not always conform to conventional ethical formulas. This is the difference between following the letter of moral law and serving the spirit of moral purpose. Imagine a doctor who must decide whether to tell a patient the complete truth about their condition, when that truth might destroy their will to fight for recovery. Or a negotiator who must choose between absolute honesty and creating space for both parties to save face and reach an agreement that serves everyone's deeper interests. These situations call for what Machiavelli understood as the art of being both lion and fox, having the courage to face difficult realities directly, while also possessing the wisdom to navigate complex social and political terrain with skill and sensitivity. You might notice how this connects back to the earlier distinction between empathy and compassion, between the kind of caring that gets overwhelmed by immediate emotional responses, and the kind that maintains enough clarity to serve what we actually care about most deeply. Machiavellian virtue, properly understood, is compassion applied to the realm of practical action. Love for the outcomes we seek translated into skillful engagement with the means required to achieve them. This doesn't mean that anything goes, that effectiveness justifies any behavior regardless of its moral cost. Rather, it means developing the sophisticated judgment needed to distinguish between compromises that serve larger ethical purposes and compromises that simply serve convenience or self-interest. It's the difference between strategic flexibility and moral relativism, between being adaptable in your methods while remaining unwavering in your ultimate commitments. Perhaps the most profound aspect of this understanding is how it reframes the relationship between inner strength and outer effectiveness. The Stoic fortress we explored earlier provides the stable foundation from which this kind of strategic flexibility becomes possible. When your core identity and values are secure, when your peace, dose, and mind doesn't depend on everyone approving of every choice you make, you can afford to be more creative, more adaptive, more responsive to the specific requirements of complex situations. Put differently, it's precisely because you have that inner citadel of self-knowledge and purpose that you can afford to be pragmatic about methods without losing your essential integrity. The person who hasn't done this inner work, who depends on external validation for their sense of moral worth, often becomes either rigidly inflexible, because any deviation from conventional rules feels like a threat to their identity, or completely unprincipled, because they have no stable internal reference point for making ethical decisions. As these thoughts wash over you like gentle waves on a moonlit shore, you might begin to sense how this integration of inner virtue and outer strategy naturally raises questions about how such principles translate into the daily work of influence and relationship. How this more sophisticated understanding of effectiveness might manifest in the art of guiding and inspiring others. This understanding opens a doorway to something you encounter every day, though perhaps without fully recognizing its profound implications. The simple truth that every morning when you choose what to wear, how to speak, how to present yourself to the world, you are engaging in an ancient art that shapes not just how others see you, but how you come to understand yourself. Picture yourself for a moment standing before a mirror in the soft light of early morning, that quiet time when the day hasn't yet taken on its familiar urgency, and you can observe your own reflection with something approaching curiosity rather than judgment. As you choose between different clothes, different expressions, different ways of holding your shoulders or arranging your face, you're making decisions that go far deeper than mere appearance. You're crafting what sociologists call a presentation of self, a carefully constructed performance that will guide every interaction you have throughout the day. Perhaps you've never thought of your daily life as a series of performances, but if you consider it gently, without any sense of criticism or cynicism, you might notice that you already do this instinctively. The version of yourself you present at work differs subtly from the one you share with close friends, which differs again from the self you reveal to strangers, which shifts once more when you're alone with family. These aren't different people exactly, but different facets of your full humanity, each one carefully selected to serve the particular needs and possibilities of different social situations. This isn't deception in any meaningful sense. It's adaptation, the natural human capacity to emphasize certain aspects of who we are while allowing others to recede into the background, depending on what the moment calls for and what we're trying to accomplish. You might think of it like the way a musician chooses different instruments for different songs, not because any one instrument is false, but because each one serves particular expressive purposes that others cannot. Interestingly, this understanding of life as performance, what the sociologist Irving Goffman called dramaturgy, reveals something profound about the relationship between authenticity and effectiveness. We often imagine these two qualities as being in tension with each other, as if being genuine somehow required abandoning any strategic awareness about how we present ourselves. But perhaps the opposite is true. Perhaps the most authentic people are those who have become skilled enough at conscious self-presentation that they can choose to reveal exactly as much of themselves as serves both their own purposes and the well-being of others. Imagine walking through a grand theater during an afternoon rehearsal, the stage lit by warm work lights that cast soft shadows across the empty seats. You can hear the distant sound of musicians tuning their instruments, the gentle murmur of actors running through their lines, the soft rustle of costumes being adjusted. There's something magical about this behind-the-scenes world, this space where the careful craft of performance is openly acknowledged and lovingly refined. No one in this environment would think of the actors as fake, because they're consciously working on their performances. Quite the opposite. Their dedication to the craft is what allows them to serve something larger than themselves. In the same way, developing skill at the dramaturgy of everyday life isn't about becoming manipulative or inauthentic. It's about becoming more conscious and more skillful at serving what you actually care about through how you show up in the world. When you understand that others are constantly forming impressions based on countless subtle cues, your posture, your tone of voice, the pace of your speech, the way you make eye contact, you can begin to make more deliberate choices about what impressions you create and why. You might have experienced this kind of conscious performance in moments when you needed to project confidence you didn't entirely feel, or when you chose to speak more softly to help someone feel safe, or when you deliberately matched someone's energy level to create better rapport. These aren't acts of deception, but acts of service, using your awareness of how communication actually works to create outcomes that serve everyone involved more effectively. As you consider this idea, letting it settle into your awareness like morning mist, you might notice how it connects to everything we've explored about the relationship between inner strength and outer effectiveness. The Stoic fortress provides the stable foundation from which conscious performance becomes possible. When you know who you are at the deepest level, when your sense of worth isn't dependent on any particular reaction from others, you can afford to be more creative and adaptive in how you present different aspects of yourself. This is the difference between performing from insecurity and performing from strength. The insecure performer is constantly trying to manage others' perceptions in order to feel better about themselves, which creates a kind of desperate energy that often backfires. The secure performer, grounded in the kind of inner clarity we explored earlier, can focus on what kind of presentation will actually serve the situation, what will help others feel comfortable, what will communicate necessary information clearly, what will move everyone toward outcomes that align with deeper values and purposes. Perhaps you've noticed this difference in others. The way some people's attempts to impress or influence feel effortful and slightly uncomfortable, while others seem to have a natural presence that draws you in without any sense of manipulation or agenda. The difference often lies not in whether they're performing, we all are, all the time, but in whether their performance serves ego needs or larger purposes, whether it comes from a place of scarcity or abundance, whether it's driven by fear or guided by wisdom. Curiously, this more conscious approach to self-presentation often leads to better relationships rather than more superficial ones. When you understand that everyone is always forming impressions anyway, based on information they can't help but notice, you can take more responsibility for making those impressions as accurate and helpful as possible. Instead of leaving others to guess what you're thinking or feeling based on random cues, you can be more intentional about communicating what will actually serve the interaction. This might mean learning to notice the difference between your internal state and what you're unconsciously broadcasting, and developing the skill to align them more consciously. If you're feeling uncertain about a decision but need to provide leadership in a crisis, you can acknowledge the uncertainty privately while choosing to project the calm confidence that will help others navigate the situation effectively. This isn't false. It's a mature recognition that your inner experience and your public presentation serve different purposes and can be managed as separate but related phenomena. You might think of it like the relationship between a musician's technique and their expression. The technique, the scales, the breathing exercises, the countless hours of practice, isn't the music itself, but it's what makes profound musical expression possible. In the same way, developing skill at conscious self-presentation isn't an end in itself, but it's what makes authentic influence and genuine service possible in a world where perception shapes reality, and where first impressions often determine whether deeper understanding will even have a chance to develop. As these insights drift through your consciousness like clouds across an evening sky, you might begin to sense how this more sophisticated understanding of authenticity as conscious craft naturally leads to questions about the subtle languages through which influence actually travels. The unspoken communications that often matter more than words, the quiet signals that determine whether trust develops or withers. Picture these ideas as landmarks in a vast intellectual landscape, each inside a mountain peak connected by hidden valleys of understanding, and allow yourself to float gently above this terrain, seeing the connections between different philosophical territories spread out below you like a living map of human nature. In this expanded view, you might notice how all the concepts we've explored, the inner fortress of Stoic strength, the strategic wisdom of Machiavellian virtue, the conscious artistry of self-presentation, point toward a fundamental truth about how human beings organize themselves in any group larger than a close family. There's something in our nature that seems to naturally create hierarchies, not necessarily as systems of domination, but as structures that help us coordinate our efforts, clarify our roles, and channel our collective energy toward shared purposes. Perhaps you've observed this process in your own experience, watching how groups of strangers gradually sort themselves into patterns of influence and deference, how some people naturally emerge as leaders while others find themselves following, how these arrangements seem to develop organically even when no one is consciously trying to create them. It's as if we carry some ancient programming that helps us quickly assess who to trust with important decisions, who to turn to for guidance, who to follow when coordination becomes necessary for survival. Imagine yourself sitting by a clear mountain stream in early morning, watching the water flow over and around the rocks in its path. The stream doesn't fight the landscape. It finds the natural channels, flows around obstacles, creates pools where the terrain invites depth, rushes where the slope encourages speed. There's something in this image that captures how healthy human hierarchies develop, not through force or manipulation, but through a kind of natural flowing toward whatever arrangements actually serve the well-being of the whole system. Interestingly, research into these natural patterns reveals something that might surprise you. The most stable and effective hierarchies aren't necessarily built on fear or intimidation, but on what we might call the currency of respect. This respect operates differently than simple affection or popularity. It's earned through demonstrated competence, reliability, and what people sense as a genuine commitment to purposes larger than personal gain. You might recognize this quality in leaders you've admired. There's something about them that makes you want to follow not because you have to, but because you trust that they can see things you might miss, and that they'll use their influence in ways that serve what you care about too. This brings us to one of the most fascinating questions in human psychology. What is it exactly that makes some people naturally compelling while others, perhaps equally well-intentioned, struggle to inspire confidence even in small groups? The answer seems to lie not in any single quality, but in a subtle combination of attributes that signal both strength and reliability, both competence and care. Perhaps you've experienced the difference between these two types of social currency in your own relationships. The person who desperately wants to be liked often creates an exhausting dynamic. Their need for approval becomes another burden you have to carry. Their anxiety about your opinion becomes something you have to manage. Their goodness, however genuine, feels somehow demanding, as if your friendship requires you to constantly reassure them that they're acceptable. This isn't malicious, but it's energetically expensive in a way that can gradually erode even well-intentioned relationships. The person who has earned your respect, by contrast, creates a very different kind of space. There's something restful about being around them, not because they're necessarily easier or less challenging, but because you sense that their well-being doesn't depend on your moment-to-moment responses. They can disagree with you without needing you to agree with them. They can make difficult decisions without requiring your approval. They can maintain their equilibrium even when you're struggling with your own. This stability becomes a gift they offer to every interaction, a foundation that allows deeper and more honest communication to develop. As you consider this distinction, letting it wash over you like gentle rain on summer leaves, you might notice how it connects to everything we've explored about the relationship between inner strength and outer effectiveness. The person who commands respect has typically done the interior work that allows them to offer their presence as a resource rather than seeking interaction as a way to meet their own unmet needs. They've built that stoic fortress of self-knowledge and emotional regulation. They've developed the Machiavellian wisdom to distinguish between what serves their ego and what serves their deeper purposes. And they've learned the dramatic arts of presenting themselves in ways that communicate their actual capacity, rather than their wishful thinking about their capacity. But perhaps the most subtle aspect of this respect-based influence is how it creates what psychologists call psychological safety for others. When you're around someone whose sense of self isn't fragile, whose mood isn't dependent on external validation, whose response to difficulty is guided by principles rather than reactivity, you can relax in ways that aren't possible with more emotionally needy people. You can disagree without fearing you'll damage them. You can share your own struggles without worrying about overwhelming them. You can even fail or make mistakes without having to manage their disappointment in addition to your own. This creates a kind of virtuous cycle where the respect someone earns through their inner stability makes others feel safe to bring their own best qualities into the relationship, which in turn makes the interaction more rewarding for everyone involved, which naturally strengthens the respect and trust that initiated the cycle. You might think of it like a well-tended garden, where the health of each plant contributes to the health of the whole ecosystem, creating conditions where everything can flourish more fully than it could in isolation. Curiously, this understanding reveals something important about the nature of authentic power. It's not something you take from others, but something that emerges from your capacity to create conditions where others can express their own power more fully. The leader who operates from this deeper understanding doesn't need to diminish others to feel important. Instead, their sense of purpose comes from helping others discover and develop their own capacities. This is the difference between dominance, which requires keeping others small, and what researchers call prestige, which grows stronger as it helps others grow stronger. Perhaps you've been fortunate enough to encounter someone who embodies this kind of authentic authority, someone whose presence somehow calls forth your own best qualities, whose confidence creates space for your own confidence to emerge, whose clarity about their own values helps you clarify your own. These encounters can be transformative, not because such people tell you what to do, but because they demonstrate what becomes possible when someone has done the deep work of integrating inner strength with outer skill. As these thoughts settle into your awareness like sediment in still water, you might begin to sense how this understanding of respect as the fundamental currency of influence naturally opens questions about the subtle arts through which such respect is actually communicated, the ways that presence itself becomes a form of language, and the mysterious processes through which some people develop the ability to shape not just what others think, but how others feel about themselves and their own possibilities. In the gentle flow of this evening's exploration, we begin to see how all these threads connect. Like a river that has gathered many tributaries, our understanding deepens and widens as we recognize the underlying current that moves through every aspect of human influence and connection. Picture yourself sitting beside a quiet pool where several mountain streams converge, each one carrying different minerals and sediments that, when they merge, create something richer and more complex than any single source could provide alone. The water closest to you is crystal clear, allowing you to see smooth stones on the bottom, but as your gaze moves toward the center where the currents meet, the water takes on deeper hues, swirling with patterns that shift and change as you watch. There's something in this image that captures what happens when we begin to understand information, not as a neutral commodity, but as the fundamental medium through which power flows in human relationships. You might have experienced this phenomenon without quite recognizing it. Those moments when someone's ability to control what information you received, when they received it, and how it was presented shaped your entire experience of a situation far more than the actual content of what was shared. Perhaps a boss who revealed project details gradually, keeping you slightly off balance and dependent on their updates. Or a friend who had a talent for being the first to share news, making themselves central to your social network simply by becoming the hub through which information flowed. These aren't necessarily manipulative people, but they intuitively understand something profound about how knowledge creates and maintains influence. As you consider this idea, letting it wash over you like gentle rain on summer leaves, imagine what it might mean to think of information as a flowing resource rather than a static possession. Like water, information seeks its own level, naturally moving from areas of abundance to areas of scarcity, creating pressure differentials that can be harnessed to accomplish work. The person who understands this dynamic doesn't need to hoard information like a miser hoarding gold, but can instead learn to manage its flow in ways that serve larger purposes while maintaining their own strategic position. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of human psychology, our relationship with uncertainty and our deep hunger for predictability. We are pattern-seeking creatures, constantly trying to make sense of our environment by identifying regularities, anticipating what comes next, preparing for likely scenarios. When someone can introduce strategic unpredictability into this process, not chaos or random confusion, but carefully calibrated uncertainty, they can create a kind of psychological dependency that's far more subtle and powerful than direct coercion. Perhaps you've encountered people who seem to have mastered this art, individuals whose responses you can never quite predict, who reveal just enough of their thinking to keep you engaged, but never enough to make you feel like you fully understand their position. There's something both frustrating and compelling about such interactions. The frustration comes from our desire for closure, for clear categories and predictable responses. The compulsion comes from something deeper. The recognition that someone who can operate outside your usual frameworks of understanding probably has access to insights or capabilities that you lack. Interestingly, this dynamic operates at multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, it might look like mere gamesmanship, the deliberate withholding of information to maintain advantage. But at a deeper level, it reflects an understanding of how learning and growth actually occur. We don't develop new capacities by receiving complete information packages. We develop them by grappling with productive uncertainty, by being challenged to expand our usual ways of thinking and responding. In other words, the strategic management of information can be a form of teaching, a way of guiding others toward their own discoveries rather than simply downloading conclusions. You might think of it like the difference between giving someone a fish and teaching them to fish, except applied to the realm of understanding rather than survival skills. The mentor who gives you just enough guidance to help you find your own way forward is serving your development in ways that someone who simply tells you what to do cannot match. This connects to something even more subtle, the power of silence and absence in communication. We live in a culture that tends to equate communication with talking, information sharing with verbal explanation, influence with persuasive speech. But perhaps you've noticed how some of the most powerful communications happen in the spaces between words. The pause that allows an important point to settle, the question that's left hanging in the air, the response that's delayed just long enough to create a sense of weight and consideration. Strategic silence operates according to principles that mirror what economists call scarcity value. When something becomes rare or difficult to obtain, its perceived worth increases dramatically. This applies not just to material goods, but to attention, approval, access, and information. The person who makes their insights, their presence, their responses into scarce resources doesn't necessarily become more valuable in any objective sense, but they are often perceived as more valuable, which in the realm of human relationships amounts to much the same thing. You might recognize this dynamic from your own experience with different communication styles. The person who responds immediately to every message, who shares every thought as soon as it occurs to them, who makes themselves constantly available, often finds their communications receiving less attention and consideration than someone who is more selective about when and how they engage. This isn't because immediate responsiveness is bad, but because constant availability can paradoxically signal that the person's time and thoughts aren't particularly precious. As these insights drift through your consciousness like morning mist, you might begin to sense something both beautiful and slightly unsettling about the nature of human interaction. We are constantly swimming in currents of information and influence that we rarely recognize explicitly, responding to subtle cues and power dynamics that operate largely below the threshold of conscious awareness. The people who are most effective at navigating these currents aren't necessarily more intelligent or more moral than others, but they've developed a kind of literacy about how information actually functions as a medium of relationship and influence. This doesn't mean that understanding these dynamics requires abandoning authenticity or developing a calculating approach to every interaction. Rather, it might mean becoming more conscious about processes that are happening anyway, more skillful at managing resources, including informational resources, that you're already using, more intentional about creating the kinds of interactions and relationships that serve what you actually care about. Perhaps the most profound insight that emerges from this understanding is how it reframes the relationship between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge, in this context, isn't just about accumulating facts or insights, but about developing the capacity to manage uncertainty, both your own and others, in ways that create space for growth, discovery, and genuine connection. Wisdom becomes not just what you know, but how skillfully you can work with what you don't know. How artfully you can create conditions where insight can emerge rather than trying to force predetermined conclusions. As these thoughts begin to weave together like threads in a tapestry, You might find yourself wondering about the personal foundation that makes this kind of sophisticated engagement possible. The inner work that allows someone to operate with both strategic awareness and genuine integrity, and whether there might be ways to develop the internal stability and clarity that serve as the bedrock for all effective action in the complex world of human relationships and influence. This understanding opens a doorway to something you've likely encountered without fully recognizing its significance: the quiet presence of people who seem to carry their own weather, who remain centered regardless of the storms swirling around them, who possess what we might call a fortress of the self. In your own life, you might notice that the most influential people you know share a particular quality, a kind of centered presence that feels both powerful and peaceful, like standing near a deep well on a summer day, sensing the cool depths even from the surface. There's something about such people that invites trust without demanding it, that creates space for authenticity without forcing it, that somehow makes others feel more capable of being their own best selves simply through the stability of their presence. Picture yourself walking through a formal garden in the early evening, where the day's heat is beginning to give way to the cooler breath of approaching night. The gravel crunches softly beneath your feet as you follow a path that winds between carefully tended beds of lavender and rosemary, their fragrances releasing into the still air with each step. In the center of this garden stands an ancient oak tree, its trunk thick and gnarled with age, its canopy spreading wide enough to shelter several smaller plantings beneath its branches. There's something in this image that captures what psychologists now call emotional intelligence, not just the ability to understand emotions, but the capacity to create conditions where both your own and others' emotional life can flourish. This isn't about suppressing feelings or maintaining a stoic detachment from the messiness of human experience. Rather, it's about developing what you might think of as emotional wisdom, the ability to feel deeply without being overwhelmed, to care intensely without being controlled by that caring, to remain present to your own inner landscape while staying responsive to the needs and dynamics of the situations you encounter. Perhaps you've experienced glimpses of this state in moments when something that would normally upset you simply didn't penetrate to that deeper place of calm, when you found yourself able to respond to conflict or crisis with a clarity that surprised even you. As you consider this quality, letting it settle into your awareness like morning dew on grass, you might notice how it connects to everything we've explored about the relationship between inner strength and outer effectiveness. The people who command authentic respect and who can navigate complex situations with both skill and integrity have typically done the patient work of developing what we might call self-mastery, not the rigid control of a tyrant over a rebellious population, but the wise stewardship of a gardener who understands the natural rhythms and needs of what they're tending. Interestingly, this self-mastery often begins with a quality that sounds deceptively simple: self-awareness. This means developing the capacity to observe your own emotional states, thought patterns, and behavioral tendencies with something approaching the detached curiosity of a scientist studying an interesting phenomenon. It's the ability to notice when you're being reactive rather than responsive, when your current emotional state is being driven more by old patterns than by present circumstances, when your need to be right is overwhelming your ability to be helpful. Perhaps you've had the experience of catching yourself in the middle of an emotional reaction and recognizing it for what it was, not an accurate assessment of the situation, but a familiar pattern triggered by something that reminded your nervous system of past experiences. These moments of recognition are precious because they create what psychologists call response flexibility, a pause between stimulus and response where conscious choice becomes possible. In that pause, you can ask yourself not just, "How do I feel about this?" but "How do I want to respond to this? And what response would serve the highest good of everyone involved?" This kind of emotional awareness creates the foundation for what researchers have identified as perhaps the most crucial leadership skill in our complex, interconnected world: the ability to regulate your own emotional state regardless of external circumstances. This doesn't mean becoming emotionally numb or disconnected, quite the opposite. It means developing the capacity to remain present to your feelings without being hijacked by them, to use your emotional responses as information rather than allowing them to dictate your actions. You might think of this like learning to be a skilled sailor rather than simply a passenger on the ship of your own experience. The passenger is at the mercy of whatever weather conditions arise, tossed about by storms, becalmed in windless periods, entirely dependent on forces beyond their control. The skilled sailor experiences the same weather, but has developed the knowledge and tools to work with whatever conditions arise, to find ways to make progress even in difficult circumstances, to remain purposeful and directed regardless of what the external environment provides. This sailing metaphor becomes particularly relevant when we consider how quickly and unpredictably the external conditions of our lives can change. The person who has built their sense of stability entirely on external circumstances, their job security, their relationship status, other people's approval, their health, their financial situation, is like a sailor who has never learned to navigate, completely dependent on perfect weather for their well-being. The person who has developed inner stability, by contrast, has created what the ancient philosophers called a citadel of the self, an inner fortress that remains secure regardless of what turbulence may be occurring in the outer world. As these ideas drift through your consciousness like clouds across a peaceful sky, you might begin to sense how this inner fortress isn't built through a single dramatic effort, but through countless small practices of attention and choice. Each time you pause before reacting, each time you choose curiosity over defensiveness, each time you respond to difficulty with problem-solving rather than blame, you're adding another stone to the walls of this internal sanctuary. It's built through what psychologists call delayed gratification, the capacity to endure short-term discomfort for long-term benefits, to plant trees under whose shade you may never sit, but which will provide shelter for others long after you're gone. Perhaps you've experienced this kind of long-term thinking in your own life, those moments when you chose the harder path because you could see it led somewhere better, when you invested time and effort in developing a skill that wouldn't pay off for months or years, when you forgave someone not because they deserved it, but because carrying resentment was weighing you down. These choices require what we might call strategic patience, the ability to hold a larger vision steady even when immediate circumstances seem to argue against it. Curiously, this capacity for patient, long-term thinking often paradoxically improves your ability to respond effectively to immediate challenges. When you're not driven by the urgency of unmet emotional needs, when your sense of worth isn't dependent on winning every argument or being right about every decision, you can afford to be more creative, more flexible, more responsive to what the actual situation requires rather than what your ego demands. You can ask better questions because you're not afraid of uncomfortable answers. You can admit mistakes because your identity isn't threatened by imperfection. You can change course when new information emerges because your self-worth isn't tied to being consistent with past positions. This integration of inner stability and outer adaptability creates what military strategists call tactical flexibility within strategic consistency, the ability to adjust your methods while remaining unwavering in your ultimate purposes. It's the quality that allows someone to be both principled and pragmatic, both idealistic and realistic, both visionary and practical. You might recognize this integration in leaders you've admired, people who seem to navigate complexity with unusual grace, who can make difficult decisions without apparent anguish, who somehow manage to serve noble purposes through skillful engagement with an imperfect world. As you drift deeper into this understanding, feeling your breathing slow and your thoughts begin to release their grip on the practical concerns of the day, you might sense how this entire journey we've taken together points toward a beautiful recognition that the ultimate resolution of the tension between being good and being effective lies not in choosing one over the other, but in developing the internal capacity to hold both qualities simultaneously. To serve what you love through whatever means prove most skillful and appropriate to the circumstances you encounter. As our journey through these ancient wisdoms draws to a close, you might find that the question itself has transformed in your hands. The way morning mist gradually reveals a landscape that was always there, but had been hidden from view. Picture yourself standing on a gentle hillside at dawn, where the night's fog is beginning to lift, and the first rays of sunlight are starting to paint the world in soft gold and rose. Below you stretches a valley you've come to know intimately over these past hours. Familiar peaks and valleys of understanding bathed now in a different quality of light. The same terrain, but somehow more spacious, more integrated, more alive with possibility. The urgency of choosing between good and dangerous has faded into something more nuanced and more hopeful, replaced by a deeper appreciation for the complexity of strength, the necessity of wisdom, and the endless, beautiful challenge of being human in a world that asks us to be both principled and practical, both idealistic and effective. You might notice that the person who truly embodies this integration, this synthesis of the Stoic sage and the Machiavellian prince, is someone quite different from either the naive idealist or the calculating opportunist that our culture often presents as the only available options. This is someone who has learned to cultivate what we might call dangerous virtue. Dangerous not because it threatens others, but because it refuses to be constrained by the false choices that keep most people oscillating between ineffective kindness and unprincipled pragmatism. They've discovered that true power lies not in choosing between their noble and strategic selves, but in the patient, lifelong work of integrating them into something whole. Perhaps you've encountered such a person in your own life, someone whose presence somehow made both goodness and effectiveness seem not only possible but natural, inevitable even. There's something about them that suggests they've done the deep interior work that allows them to offer their principles as a gift rather than a burden, their strength as a resource rather than a threat, their influence as a form of service rather than domination. They've built that inner citadel so thoroughly that it becomes invisible, like the foundation of a house that you never see but that makes everything else possible. Interestingly, this integration often makes such people appear deceptively simple on the surface, even as they navigate complex situations with unusual grace. They've developed what you might think of as sophisticated naturalness, the ability to be strategic without being calculating, principled without being rigid, effective without being manipulative. They've learned to work with the grain of human nature rather than against it, to find ways to serve their deepest values through means that acknowledge rather than deny the messy realities of how change actually happens in a world where not everyone shares their commitments. As these insights settle into your awareness like morning dew on grass, you might begin to sense something profound about the nature of authenticity itself. The person who has achieved this synthesis isn't trying to be authentic. They've moved beyond the need to perform authenticity because they've become secure enough in their own identity to express different facets of themselves as different situations require. They understand that being genuine doesn't mean being the same in every context, but rather means bringing their full capacity to bear on whatever circumstances they encounter. This is perhaps the most liberating recognition of all, that you don't have to choose between being good and being effective, between serving your values and succeeding in the world, between maintaining your integrity and developing the skills needed to actually accomplish things that matter. The choice that seemed so stark at the beginning of our journey, stop being good, start being dangerous, reveals itself as an invitation to something more nuanced and more powerful. The possibility of becoming dangerous in the service of goodness, effective in the expression of love, strategic in the pursuit of what you hold most sacred. Put differently, the truly dangerous person, in the most constructive sense of that word, is someone who has learned to be unshakable in their commitment to what matters while remaining completely flexible about how to serve those commitments in an ever-changing world. They've developed what military strategists call tactical flexibility within strategic consistency, the ability to adapt their methods endlessly while never compromising their essential purposes. This makes them formidable not because they're willing to harm others, but because they're so centered in their own values and so skilled in their engagement with reality that nothing external can deflect them from their chosen path. Perhaps you can feel this integration beginning to take shape in your own understanding, like a puzzle that has been gradually assembling itself throughout our time together. The Stoic's inner fortress provides the unshakable foundation. The Machiavellian's strategic wisdom provides the skillful means. The dramaturgist's awareness provides the conscious artistry. The information theorist's understanding provides the subtle influence. All of these streams flow together into something that transcends any single tradition or approach, a way of being in the world that serves both the individual's development and the collective good, both personal effectiveness and universal values. As you let these thoughts dissolve now like morning mist, releasing any need to hold on to them tightly or figure them out completely, you might find yourself resting in a space that feels both familiar and transformed. The landscape of your own possibilities has perhaps grown more spacious, more forgiving of complexity, more appreciative of the long game that real wisdom requires. The responsibility for the ends to which this understanding is directed remains with you, as it must. But you carry with you now not rigid answers but better questions, not certainties, but a deeper appreciation for the artistry that real living requires. And perhaps by morning, you'll have discovered that what makes someone truly dangerous in the best sense is not their willingness to abandon their principles, but their commitment to building something so strong and centered within themselves that nothing external can shake their ability to do what's right, whatever forms that rightness may need to take in the endless variety of circumstances that life provides. The danger they represent to the world is not the threat of harm, but the possibility of transformation. The quiet revolution that happens when someone demonstrates that goodness and effectiveness, virtue and power, love and wisdom need not be enemies, but can become allies in the sacred work of creating more beauty, more justice, more flourishing in whatever corner of the world they're called to serve. Let these thoughts settle now like sediment in still water, becoming part of the quiet foundation upon which tomorrow's choices will rest. Knowing that the integration of strength and kindness, strategy and virtue, effectiveness and love is not a destination to reach but a practice to live, not a problem to solve but a dance to learn, step by patient step, breath by mindful breath, choice by conscious choice, throughout all the beautiful complexity of a life lived fully awake. As these thoughts settle into the deepest parts of your mind, no longer needing to be held or understood, but becoming part of the quiet fabric of rest itself, Machiavelli's ancient question dissolves like morning mist into something larger and more peaceful. The boundaries between wisdom and sleep beginning to blur until there's no difference between understanding and dreaming, between the philosopher's insights and your own gentle breathing. These ideas drift now beyond the need for answers, beyond the urgency of choosing between good and dangerous, flowing into that vast space where all paradoxes resolve not through thinking but through release, where strength and kindness merge like rivers meeting the sea. Perhaps in dreams these insights will find their own expression, or perhaps they'll simply become part of the deeper knowing that needs no conscious thought, part of the eternal conversation between who we are and who we might become. And you're already drifting beyond words now, beyond philosophy, beyond even the need to know whether you're remembering or forgetting, carried by the gentle current of your own breathing toward that distant shore where all questions rest in the vast quiet that holds everything and asks for nothing. Flowing into sleep itself, where understanding becomes feeling, and feeling becomes peace, and peace becomes this endless, gentle disappearing into whatever dreams are waiting.